Hello and welcome to PressTV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Taghvai. As the crisis in Syria marked its first year recently, one thing that everyone agrees on is that the deaths of innocent people needs to stop. And for that to happen, violence needs to stop. That is, if the United States, EU, Saudi Arabia and Qatar stop arming and funding the armed groups fighting the governments, which puts into question whether they do want peace in Syria and whether they want UN Arab League envoy Kofi Annan's six-point peace plan to work. The situation looks bleak since the Syrian army is confiscating U.S. and foreign weapons and are engaged with them almost on a daily basis. In this news analysis, we will discuss whether the deadline, April 12, 6 a.m. Damascus time, will be the start of a new chapter in Syria's history or a turn for the worse.
Heavy explosions and gunfire continue to shake Syria. Fighting carries on between the government forces and what Damascus calls foreign-backed armed terrorist groups. Syria has lashed out at some foreign countries it says are giving weapons to such groups.
The Qataris, the Saudis and Turkey are providing these armed groups with weapons. This is a violation of the international law.
The fighting rages on as the date for a UN Arab League brokered ceasefire draws closer. The UN Arab League envoy Kofi Annan says the government forces and the armed groups must stop hostilities at 6 a.m. April 12th, though the deadline is April the 10th.
We must commence a comprehensive political dialogue between the Syrian government and the whole spectrum of the Syrian opposition. This must enable a Syrian-led political transition to a democratic, plural political system in which citizens are equal regardless of their affiliations or ethnicities or beliefs.
Syria has agreed to a six-point peace plan hammered out by Annan to end the unrest in the country. The opposition says it has serious doubts about the Syrian government's commitment to the Annan peace plan. But in a letter to the diplomat, the government complains that, quote, acts of terrorism by the armed groups are on the rise ahead of the truce deadline. Veto-holding member of the UN Security Council, Russia, has warned against any ultimatums for Syria and against giving weapons to the armed groups fighting the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
The Syrian government has accepted Annan's proposal and has begun implementing them. And it is very important not to undermine this process with ultimatums and threats.
Meanwhile, latest reports have exposed exaggerations and fabrications about the situation on the ground. A journalist who only recently resigned from the Qatari government-funded Al Jazeera over the channel's conduct has also accused it of telling lies about the developments in Syria.
The reality on the ground in Syria is different from what is portrayed by Al Jazeera. The reality is much different. The truth is now just an opinion of the director. In Al Jazeera, I can even lie to benefit the production.
This is not the first time Al Jazeera is accused of distorting facts about Syria. It uses Syria, the war within, as header of its stories on the violence in the country. This is while Damascus says many militants from other countries have infiltrated on foreign countries' behalf to fight the Syrian government.
Let me go first to you, Mr. Chossudovsky. The UN Arab League Special Envoy Kofi Annan couldn't be clearer in his message yesterday. Violence and deaths need to stop. Who is preventing that right now from happening?
Well, I think that the Kofi Annan peace proposal is flawed from the outset because it does not clearly identify the sides involved in the ceasefire. In fact, it identifies the government on the one hand and the so-called opposition on the other hand. But the fact of the matter is that there are now NATO special forces from NATO countries, not to mention Qatari special forces and intelligence operatives, which are collaborating with the so-called Free Syrian Army in terms of logistics, military advice, the supply of weapons, And this is in violation of international law because these are foreign forces on Syrian soil. The Syrian government has pointed to the role of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but it has not mentioned the fact that there are British and French special forces on the ground collaborating with the terrorists against government forces. So that you can't have a ceasefire demanded by members of the international community, namely France and Britain, and have special forces from those countries on the ground collaborating with the Free Syrian Army. I should mention another issue. It is now clearly documented, even in Western media sources, that the Free Syria Army is integrated by death squads, which are involved in extrajudicial assassinations of people in the various communities. This was documented with regard to Homs. We're talking about assassinations. We're talking about ethnic cleansing directed against the Christian community in particular. Crimes against humanity are being committed by foreign forces which have integrated the Free Syrian Army. They are complicit in these war crimes.
Well, let's look at another war that's happening, and that's the media war on this. And Professor Chossudovsky, let's focus on the role of this media in which several reporters and producers of the Qatari government-funded TV channel Al Jazeera have resigned over the role that is playing in fanning the flames of war. It's been accused of this media war machine by its former reporters. Let's listen what this particular reporter had to say about this.
The reality on the ground in Syria is different from what is portrayed by Al Jazeera. The reality is much different. The truth is now just an opinion of the director. In Al Jazeera, I can even lie to benefit the production. When I told them about my resignation, they sat with me for hours trying to convince me not to quit. But my mind was already made up. After I submitted my resignation letter, my decision was firm. I knew I wasn't going to retreat on my decision.
Professor Chossudovsky, you heard the reporter there, ex-reporter of Al Jazeera. What do you think? It does sound like the truth is being skewed, doesn't it?
Well, this is, of course, not an isolated phenomenon, Al Jazeera. We are bombarded with media lies on a daily basis. As an organization committed to truth in media, our research center is confronted with that on a daily basis. When I started investigating Syria, that was in fact shortly after I left the country in March of last year, the first reports were totally fabricated, and we had to find documentary evidence occasionally within the Lebanese and Israeli press which confirmed unequivocally that they were terrorist acts right from the beginning, acts of arson, assassinations of civilians, well-organized brigades, and at that time the media consensus was to say that this was a peaceful protest movement. And that consensus actually prevailed for quite a while. People were being killed by terrorists, and the media all over the world, and I listened to the Canadian media, the U.S. media, the European media, they were lying through their teeth. They were telling us that this was a peaceful protest movement, when in fact the so-called opposition were there with machine guns, and then they would twist realities upside down and say, no, these people who are killing are government forces, they're snipers, when in fact they were terrorists. So that it was an utter string of lies, of manipulation of images. They used the pro-government rallies in favor of President Bashar al-Assad to illustrate the resentment or opposition which was supposed to take place when it all started in Dara, which is a small border city right on the border with Jordan. 45,000 inhabitants. There was no protest movement. There was no mass movement. This was the initial process of bringing in the terrorists, and They were right from the beginning attacking government buildings, killing the police and the armed forces, but also killing civilians. And then what we have is this very gruesome media ritual of actually acknowledging the death of civilians and then using those deaths of civilians by the so-called opposition forces and then blaming the government. So that is really the whole basis of this responsibility to protect. You go in with killer brigades, death squadrons, you kill people, and then after that you blame the government. That is not to say that the government doesn't bear some responsibility in the way it has handled this crisis.
Right.
But right from the beginning, the protest movement was not recognized, it was presented as a protest movement when in fact it was an insurrection.
And I'm going to bring in Professor Chossudovsky for the final statement. Professor Chossudovsky, April 12, 6 a.m. Damascus time, a new page in Syria's history, do you think, towards political resolve, or is there going to be a continuation of violence?
Well, let me simply go back to the issue of Kofi Annan, which is very important. Kofi Annan is not a peacemaker. Kofi Annan is a war maker. He has stated his position on numerous occasions that it's the collaboration of the United Nations with NATO, and that goes back to 1999, to the Kosovo War. How Kofi Annan was Under Secretary for United Nations Peacekeeping. He was then appointed Secretary General, and he was appointed by the United States. After they got rid of the previous Secretary General of the United Nations, so that we have to understand that Kofi Annan is also one of the main architects of responsibility to protect, which was endorsed by the United Nations. So there we have a situation where the United Nations is complicit in the so-called humanitarian
I'm so sorry. I got to unfortunately cut in since we're fresh out of time. I do apologize. Let me thank our guest from the Syrian Social Club, Issa Shire from London, former Pentagon official Michael Maloof. Thank you so much. And Director of Center for Research on Globalization. That was Professor Michel Chossudovsky, who was talking to us from Montreal. Thank you for watching another edition of the PressTV News Analysis. Any questions or comments? Newsroom@presstv.ir is our email address. From me, and the entire team, it's goodbye.